What do you think is the most prominent sin today for Christians? I don't think that it's murder. Probably it's not even adultery. Gossip might be too obvious. What if it's this? What if the most prominent sin today, especially for Christians, is failing to observe the Sabbath? Leviticus chapter 25, God sets a Sabbath for the land for Israel. And it says this in chapter 25, verse 1. The Lord speaks to Moses on Mount Sinai, and he says, "When you have entered the land I am giving you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath rest before the Lord every seventh year. For 6 years you may plant your fields and prune your vineyards and harvest your crops. But during the seventh year, the land must have a Sabbath year of complete rest." In other words, one entire year of no planting, no harvesting, no tilling the soil, nothing. A land exclusively for rest. And he's not just commanding his people to rest, he's commanding the land to rest. He's commanding the thing that produces their food to rest. And it actually means this. It means trust in God, and provision comes from God and God alone. Just a few verses later, God actually reminds all of Israel that he owns it all anyway. He says this in verse 23, chapter 25. "The land must never be sold on a permanent basis, for the land belongs to me. You are only foreigners and tenant farmers working for me." He's trying to teach his people that God owns everything. He owns the land, he owns the people, and he owns their future as well. He's also in charge of everything that is provided for them, all of their provision. God owns it all. And there's a lesson here that God is trying to teach Israel, and he's also trying to teach us. It's that striving and self-effort and working are meaningless when you consider the fact that God owns everything. This pattern of Sabbath actually began in Genesis chapter 25. Starts in verse 2. "On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, so he rested. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy." Something powerful and interesting is taking place, because if you know the creation story, something really significant happened just before the Sabbath day. Do you remember what it was? On day 6, God actually formed Adam and Eve, the first two humans ever in existence. And it's an interesting thought that on day 6, God would create humanity, and on day 7, he would cause them and he would rest. Actually, humanity's first assignment was to simply rest. It wasn't started with working. It wasn't started by Adam naming all the animals. It wasn't starting by them preparing and tending to the garden. The very first commandment from God was rest. It's so hard for us today because we love control, but actually Jesus gives us something really, really good about rest in Matthew chapter 11. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." When it comes to Sabbath, one of the most interesting and powerful things that you have to understand is it's not about relaxation. It's about trust. I was listening to a podcast a few years ago that forever changed my life about Sabbath. He's a Jewish rabbi, and he really takes the Sabbath seriously. He observes the Sabbath. And he says, every single Sabbath, I don't make my bed. He said, that's very different from my character, because if you knew me, you would understand that every single morning, the first thing that I do is I make my bed. He says, and I don't make my bed on Sabbath. He said, when I walk into my room, I don't like how it looks. I have an unmade bed. But it's a reminder to me that God loves me and is there for me, even in the middle of my mess. He said that, and I guess he's a bald man, and he said, every single day I shave my head. He said, on Sabbath I don't. And every single time I look in the mirror and I see that stubble on my head, and I don't like how it looks. But on Sabbath, it's a physical reminder that God loves me no matter how I look and no matter who I am. And even though Leviticus chapter 25 is about rest for the land, we can also read it and remember that it should be about rest for our souls. It should be about trust. Sabbath isn't just about relaxation, but it's about trusting God in everything. So my question to you is, when was the last time you took a true day of rest? When was the last time you took a true Sabbath?